So can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you wanted to come to this seminar?
So my name is Geetanjali Misra and I'm the executive director of a feminist human rights organization called CREA. It's based in Delhi, but we also work in other countries in the Middle East, in East Africa, and in Central Asia. We work on issues of feminist leadership and sexual and reproductive freedoms for all. So in that context, I wanted to come to this conference, one, because I was interested in this area of childhood studies, because childhood is a long period of time, and we work on adolescent sexual rights, we work on, and children are a special category of people. When confronted with issues of sexual rights, you have to deal with all the dilemmas and the rough edges. And I was interested in how academics conceptualize this field of feminism in childhood.
And you gave a paper. Can you tell us a little bit more about this paper? Especially, you know, it is actually framed around consent, so that's the first word in the title. Can you just elaborate?
Yeah. So for me, I was really interested in how, so my paper is Consent, Disentangling Childhood and Motherhood from, you know, this word, and how do you deal with children and this word, how do you empower younger people with the capacity to consent, believe in their consent, teach them how to consent, because I do feel consent is a human rights standard that can be applied to sexual rights. It's the standard for sexual legitimacy, consent as a standard for sexual legitimacy. It's a more modern standard that has developed in the field of sexuality. It goes beyond reproduction, beyond morality as a standard. So my paper is really about children and how the practical ideas of consent play out in the lives of children, and children at the margins of children. So like trans kids, kids that are born intersexed. So I was also trying to work with the conversations that are sometimes left out of childhood, and the imagined child is always the innocent child, the young child, the non-disabled child. So in my paper, I also explore, you know, ideas of consent and disability consent and trans consent, and so that's what my paper is about.
And also, what was noticeable in your paper and really interesting is this idea of maybe dislodging the norm. So not just for children, but also for this sort of idea of motherhood. And how does it help you with the idea of consent, to frame consent? How does it help you to move away from that idea of a mother?
So I guess a lot of CREA's work is about dislodging the norms. I like that, dislodging the norms, and seeing what happens to people who dislodge the norms or stray away from the norms or question the norms. And so even in the context of motherhood, so both the things in the conference, motherhood and childhood, are very normative in the ideas and the heads of people. So in that sense, thinking about, even in the context of motherhood, what are different forms of motherhood, why are we essentializing, naturalizing, normalizing what is a mother? So just like in childhood, you have an imagined subject that's a child, you have an imagined subject that's a mother. And to also within that context, you know, the consent around whether you want to have children, when you want to have children, not want to have children, you know, does that play into what feminists are trying to do with motherhood as well?
And still within that idea, you talked a little bit about the best interest of the child, you know, as key to this idea of, you know, the norm, and how, and there was conflict, you know, and you gave an example where the best interest of the child, I mean, who decides on the best interest of the child, and where the best interest of the child was actually serving, well, was used in childhood and was used in motherhood to actually do a disservice to real people who are, you know, who are straying from the norm. let's say?
So best interest of the child, best interest of the woman, best interest of the person is, I think, maybe the kind of the foundation for how you can do the work. Like, do we want to explore what we think may be the best interest of the child? And of course, our assumptions and what is the best interest of the child could be very different. And so I don't want to assume that if you are saying best interest of the child, you know what's the best interest of the child. It's in quotes. But at least if we begin by putting the child, whatever this child, young person, mother, woman, at the center, and then working on your framework conceptually or your intervention practically from that space. I think that's what I'm trying to say in the paper.
There was another sort of tension around the idea of consent, and also, you know, you're sort of trying to look at consent and you know, consent and children. What about young children and consent? How would this work?
So consent works based on what you're trying to do with it. Mm-hmm. Consent in the law would be very different than consent at home, or consent in terms of at least saying that children are capable of consenting, and then seeing where you know, when you take away consent, when you teach them how to consent. And consent means yes, no, repeated yes, no's, maybe. So really giving, as young as possible, some spaces where children could be more autonomous and have some way of thinking about autonomy and choice via consent.
And so do you believe that, you know, do you believe that it has to be completely autonomous, or do you believe that, you know, in a way it's there's some sort of a interdependent, you know, sort of a relation in the idea of consent?
Well, everything in the world is interdependent, interrelated. There's no kind of choice that happens in a vacuum. You're always mediating your environment, everybody around you, the choices that you have, which could be limited. You know, there could be more choices for one person, less choices for the other. But within that, are you making or giving that person the right to make a choice for themselves, even if it's not a choice that you would make? So in brief, that's what I would think in terms of consent.
And last question, so what are some of the key things that have emerged from the discussions we've had?
So for me, maybe because I come more from an activist, non-profit background, I think for me, what I was also interested in more, and one of the key things I'm thinking is there needs to be more interaction between theory and practice, where you're theorizing practice and practicing theory, and that we need to have more practitioners in the room, or vice versa. I know a lot of academics have come from community organizing and elsewhere, but so one key takeaway is how do we make the spaces more kind of inclusive of both. Secondly, I think I was really interested in some of the conceptual ideas that I will go back and explore more, temporality, issues of economics and kids. And so for me, some of the key themes, also in terms of childhood studies, I just didn't know it was such a big field of work and people are working on it, because maybe in India, we don't hear people talk a lot about childhood studies. So I also want to kind of go back and explore, are people working on in this field in general?
Thank you, Geeta.